Good afternoon, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be with you all here today. I'm so excited to get to share what I think is such an important topic with you. We're going to talk for just a few minutes, a little shorter than an hour, to see if we have some time for some questions about trauma-informed care in the early childhood setting. And when I think about that, as Mariah mentioned, I am a professional learning consultant from Frog Street Press, and I'm so happy to be here representing Frog Street today. But one of the things that I want to share with you all as we begin to talk about this particular topic is one of my favorite quotes from Helen Keller. Alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. And I think when you think about the topic that we're going to talk about today, it truly does have an impact on where we are in our early childhood setting. For many, many years, I served as a center director, like many of you are on the call today. For about 15 years of my career, actually, I was a center director in many faith-based organizations or secular organizations. At one point in time, I was a Head Start director or an early Head Start director of a very large Head Start program. And when I begin to think about the topic of trauma, becoming trauma informed, it definitely wasn't something that I had in the forefront of my mind. And so I want to start out by asking you a question. So let's answer in the chat box, if you will. When you see the word safe, when I put the word safe on the screen, what do you think about? What are some things that you think about when you see the word safe? Let's type a few responses in the chat box, if you will. Often, when I ask this question, security and growth, Heather says security and growth. And so, you know, it's interesting because many years ago when Judy, no injuries. Injuries and safety and those kinds of custodial safety practices was the answer that I got, I would say pre-COVID. That was usually always the answer. Now we're starting to have a more common language, and a language that is more talked about amongst us as individuals, that brings in that added scope of sense of safety and security, growth, comfort, all of those things. And I want to say that, you know, I try to make lemon out of lemonade, right? And when I think about one of the good things that came out of for early childhood during the pandemic, it was the opportunity to kind of have those open conversations about the sense of safety and security when it comes to mental wellness and support. And so I want you to think about that as we go through and begin our conversation today. So we're going to talk, you know, when I was asked to come on and talk to this group, one of the things that we talked about is exactly the points that you want to know and scratch the surface. So I kind of liken the opportunity that I have today as we might be scratching a little scab off of a lot of wounds. And I want you to think about it as in relation to yourself, your staff that you have, and also the children who you have in your care. And know that this is really, really just the very, very beginning of a much longer conversation that we could definitely have on this topic. And so let me hear from you again. What is your role? When you think about your role in early education, what is that? What is your role in early education? And so when you think about your role, one of the things, yeah, guidance and support, great. Thank you, Heather, for your response. Definitely guidance and support would be one of them. And then the goals, when you think about who you are and where you are in your walk of early childhood, think about the goals that you might have for those that you serve, whether that be, in leadership role, we're serving children, we're serving families, we're serving staff. And so I want you to really think about some of the goals that you serve. And you guys are really talking about that in the chat box, and you're really kind of seeing some of those goals come alive. And as a result of your role and those goals, reflect just a moment about what you know about this topic of trauma-informed care. What do you know about this topic of trauma-informed care? And so as you're reflecting on that, I want to take you back to some of your earliest memories. And for some of you, what you see on the screen, this picture perfect little family here stomping in the water puddles, looks like having a great fun, is where you were as a child. And for some of us, we're thinking, wow, wouldn't that have been nice? And so I want to share a little bit about myself and a little bit about the work that I do in the trauma-informed world. So I live in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm proud to be the co-chair of the early care and education sector of the South Texas Trauma-Informed Consortium. So what that means is that we're working really diligently in our community to share information that revolve around, for both children and staff members and center directors and leaders and coaches and specialists, revolve around early childhood memories and the impact that early childhood really does have on everyone in that child development center. And so we do that by really talking with everybody that will listen through training such as this or many other kinds of things. And we introduce them to a term that is often known by the acronym of ACEs. And ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So it often goes by the acronym ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And in the original ACEs study back in the early 90s, the three overarching things that were considered were really surrounding the household. So it was abuse, whether that be physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse. It was neglect, physical or emotional neglect, household dysfunction, which could have been anything from living with someone who has a mental illness to having somebody who is incarcerated, living with somebody who, a relative who might be incarcerated, substance abuse or misuse. And here, this is one of the original graphics. And I like to stick with this graphic, but I like to call folks' attention to, it used to be in our old way of thinking that we often only thought about domestic abuse as the mother being treated violently. Now we know that their domestic abuse stems across all sexes and all races, right? And also household dysfunction in terms of divorce. And that's a hard one for some folks to swallow because they don't really realize the impact of that. And often it's not the impact of the divorce in the adult, it is the disattachment or lack of attachment that that child may have had with that individual who's no longer living in the household. But since the original ACEs study, we've come to know far more about adversity. we've come to know that, yes, there is this realm of household dysfunction, right? But there could also be things that could cause um, adversity within a community. And those are things like community violence, discrimination, lack of jobs, substandard wages, right? Poor air quality, food insecurity or food deserts. Many of you on the call may be working in or have your centers in places where you see this pretty prevalently, right? And the impact that it actually has on everyone who lives in that community. And then further research that has been done really talks about our environment. So, when I think about the work that I do in California, it's often about the wildfires and how that has really impacted the children and the families. Or when I think about the work that I do in Louisiana, it's about the hurricanes, or Mississippi, it's about the hurricanes. And so you have to really kind of think about, as we've expanded our knowledge and as science has progressed, we really know that, in fact, adversity and the impact of adversity has progressed from just that household, what's going on in our own four walls, if you will, to yet our community, and also to what is going on environmentally. And so, as I want to, of course, you can't talk about adverse childhood experiences without talking about our recent pandemic and the pandemic we're all still experiencing. And it wasn't until I read some of the work of Dr. Gabor Mate in The Realm of Hungry Ghosts, in the book where he talks about this idea of emotional unavailability. And in that, in the learning and understanding more about the term of emotional unavailability, I often think about it related to the pandemic and how, yes, many of our families were maybe home together for a period of time, but the instability of jobs, the instability of that social connection was prevalent, and in some cases still is in the pandemic, and caused some of the adults living in the household to be emotionally unavailable to their children. And emotional unavailability also lives outside, obviously, of the pandemic. And you have to really think about who those adults are in that child's life, and what is their emotional capacity to help regulate that child. And so that brings me back to a lot of why I do this work, and the way that I grew up, and really thinking about how I was reared as a child and some of my dysfunctions. And I tell everybody that I really am passionate about the work that I do in this particular space, because a lot of those things that I have learned along the way. And for those of you who serve the community who are low socioeconomic status, the one thing that I want to stress to you is the additional layer that poverty brings to families, that additional stress. And there's a great video, should you be interested, on YouTube, and it's How Does Toxic Stress of Poverty Hurt the Developing Brain? It was put out by PBS, and then the Council for Professional Recognition, the CDA Council, also has a really good white paper about the poverty cycle and the impact of on pre-K. And so, we can't continue the conversation without stopping to think about exactly kind of this additional layer of stress, right? And so I'm going to launch my very first poll question. And here we go. So here's what I want to know. When you think about the children at your center, or the centers that you serve, for those of you who are coaches, have you thought about behavior being linked to adverse childhood experiences? So just a few minutes to answer that poll question. Yeah, Cindy, I agree. It is a great video. It is one that everybody should watch, and it's not very long. So take some time after the webinar today and watch it. I'm glad to see that many of you are answering yes, hence the reason probably why you're here today. So as I end the poll, the majority of you actually have thought about that. And I'm really glad to hear that you've thought about that, because as we transition the conversation, one of the things that I want to share with you is there is a free screener that you can take yourself. It's for adults, and you can share with your staff members if you're so inclined, or those other adults around you. And this free screener is offered by the National Public Radio. Now, when you see the screener, it's only a 10-question quiz. And so when you think about those 10 questions relate back to what we know as that household dysfunction. But in fact, it doesn't mention anything about the other two realms of adversity. So there are some things missing there. There are some things missing. And I think the most important thing for us as adults to understand is that ACEs are very, very common. Even back with the original ACEs study that was done by Kaiser Permanente, what they found was 64% of the population that they surveyed, which was middle-class America, so to speak, because it was actually a survey that was done for an insurance company, 64% of them had at least one adverse childhood experience out of those 10, right? And from that original study, this is what they found. Relationship of child abuse and household dysfunction, the leading cause of death in adults. And when you talk about that, when you think about that, that is huge. So in fact, what they're saying is what happened to you as a child still continues to have an impact on you when you are an adult. And so when I think about that, I think about the work that has been done by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and now she is the sitting in California, continuing to do the great work that she started with as their Surgeon General. And again, another YouTube video. If you are so inclined to take the quiz, one of the things that I want you to think about is watching her video, How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime. Because I don't think that we, the majority of us, as we begin to have this conversation and really talk openly about it, had any idea that it has an impact on our health across a lifetime. In fact, what we know is that individuals as adults who reported that they had 4 or more ACEs as a child, they are 3 times more likely to have some sort of lung disease, 14 times more likely to have attempted suicide. All of our major health issues that are tied to inflammation, my friends, this is it. Because what happens in your body when your body experiences a tremendous amount of stress is that inflammation builds up in your body, hence your heart disease, your lung disease, some of our arthritis, all of those kinds of things. And it was really interesting that, you had the American Academy of Pediatrics come out to say that adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And so as we think about that in how we relate to ourselves as individuals, and how we are relating to children in our classrooms, what we have to think about is basic brain development, right? Basic neuroscience. And that neuroscience is pretty simple. It is so simple, in fact, that it's often disregarded. And what we don't understand is that trauma and that stress stays in our bodies and will come out eventually. And it often comes out in behaviors that we see in the classroom. And we know that a traumatized brain is definitely bottom heavy, right? And so when you think about the idea of being bottom heavy, and you think about the notion of the adult that is in the classroom most often, we can't help but think about our industry as a whole. And we can't help but think about the additional layers of stress that our industry has perpetuated itself in, just something as meaningful as the wage across our industry, right? And so it's interesting because in our work here in San Antonio, one of the things that we have continued to do with our local chapter of AEYC and different nonprofit organizations is we are continuing to give the ACEs study and during many trainings. And what we have found out of over 800 individuals that have chosen to participate in those trainings is that, in fact, those individuals are suffering from 4 or more ACEs. And so we know that it has an impact in our classroom. We know that it has an impact in our classroom because of the wage. And so there's that added layer of stress. And so we have to think about this next poll question as we're continuing to think about our environments and what we are doing to support our staff. And so here's your next poll question. When you think about center staff, have you considered their needs when thinking about their past experience? So I'll give you just a few minutes to answer that. We've got almost everyone responding. And I'm going to share the results. So 77% of you have said yes, 23% no. So as we continue the conversation, I want you to kind of keep that in the forefront. And here's what I want you to think about. Those individuals in that classroom, friends, they're responsible for that brain development, aren't they? Most of the children in a typical early childhood setting, I was talking yesterday to a group, and we were talking about just transition time. And we were talking about, how many hours in a day children are with those teachers and those caregivers. And, we know it's on average, if the family or the adult who's bringing them is working full time, it's an average of anywhere between 35 and probably 43, if not more. Some of you are laughing going, little Melissa, she shows up at 6 in the morning, she don't leave till 6 in the afternoon. And that girl is never absent, right? And so what we have to think about is what these individuals who may have some adversity that they're carrying on their shoulders are responsible for. And so they're responsible for that brain wiring that is so crucial to the foundation of learning. And so when you look at the windows of opportunity, you think about what are some of those things? Well, gosh, guys, it's trust and attachment, right? Trust and attachment lays the foundation and that opens the door for all other learning. And that is wired at such an early age. It's wired at such an early age. And that's why, when I think about those infant teachers and I think about the care that we are giving those babies in the classroom and who is giving that care, I can't help but think about this. And so, what I want to share with you is also the idea and the notion that when children come to us, we don't often think about where they come from, even as far back as in the womb. Because what we know and what has been verified by science is that from conception and utero has a huge impact on the brain wiring of that newborn, believe it or not. And one day when we have longer time to spend together, I'll share with you some of my own personal experiences with that. But hence, Dr. Pam Schiller, our senior author, I think, of all things Frog Street, one of the things that I love most is this quote: "What you teach me birth to 3 will be what matters most to me." And when you think about that in the idea of adversity, you can't help, or you shouldn't dismiss that 80 to 85% of a child's brain is wired by the time they're age 3. It's a lot of wiring. And then when you think about what you teach me birth to 3 will most likely be what matters most to me, or at most likely, oh, here we are, I had it memorized. Most likely what makes me thrive. You have to think about that additional wiring by age five. For just a moment, think about the wiring that you had by age 5. And what are some of those things? What are some of those experiences that you're still carrying with you? And what are those experiences that those children who are walking through your doors every day are bringing with them? So we have to understand, as leaders in the early childhood space, that early childhood educators, they're true brain architects, guys. They are true brain architects. They're responsible for building brains. And so I want to share with you something that I want you to share with everybody that you come into contact with. And I did this for my staff many times, and I just as a gentle reminder. And almost at every professional development, we would give just a little tube of toothpaste. And I heard Dr. Junie Lee, he was formerly of the Mr. Rogers Institute, now he's over at Harvard Grad School, say this, and it has stuck with me for many years. And what he said is that those educators in that classroom are the most active ingredient in that classroom. You can use the very best Frog Street curriculum. You can have the best furnishings, but it's them who actually make all of that work. They are truly the most active ingredient, just like fluoride is the most active ingredient in toothpaste, right? Just like fluoride. And you can buy all kinds of fancy toothpaste. Believe me, I've checked it out. And still the active ingredient is fluoride. So we have to begin to think about the impact that adversity might be having on those caring for our youngest children because of their responsibility. And so when you think about how you recognize trauma, listen, it's very simple. Behavior is the language of trauma. Behavior is the language of trauma. And when you think about that as an adult, what I want you to think about is that time that you are most ashamed of when you just blew your top at someone, right? Because you just couldn't take it anymore. Behavior is the language of stress and trauma, especially in children, because they're not often equipped with the skills that they need to express themselves. They're not often equipped with the skills that they need to express themselves. And so when you think about that, I want you to really think about, I'm a master trainer for the Community Resilience Initiative. And I think when I think about my learnings with the Community Resilience Initiative, this is one of the things that sticks out to me the most. Guys, every second, listen, every single second of the day, you're taking in millions and millions and millions of sensory input is going into that brain. Millions of sensory inputs going into that brain. That sensory input, your brain is processing it. And those kids' brains are processing it so quickly based on their past experiences. Is this something really, really good? Or is this something that is really, really bad? And so what that does is it's going to give you two totally different states of interpretation. The impact of that is going to either be unbalanced, right? You're gonna, and when you're unbalanced, what happens? You get this really bad chemical dump that happens, that cortisol goes right to your brain. You have this instant thought of, am I gonna fight, flight, or freeze? And then it's exhausting for us when we do that. But it happens so quickly that we don't even have time to think about it. If we as an adult don't have time to be in that prefrontal cortex, the children obviously aren't capable of that either. Or is that something that is not really a threat to us? And we can stay, that it's that joy juice, as Dr. Becky Bailey says, that happens to go into our brain, and we can have social engagement, and it makes us feel good, right? But what you have to remember, it's based on past experiences. The prediction of those past experiences drive behavior. And often we don't know what those sensory triggers are going to be for us or as an adult, or even for the children in our classroom. And it happens in a split second. And so some of the cues, some of the behaviors that you see are consistent across the board, right? Difficult to soothe. There could be withdrawal, there could be difficult in transition. But remember, it's that sensory input that is responsible for this output. And that's a hard one, particularly when we don't have a lot of insight into maybe where those adults or those children are coming from. So when you think about what do you know about stress and trauma in young children, here are a couple of thoughts. It's all about the relationship. Relationship is the number one protective factor. The better you're connected with somebody, the more they're going to learn. Matter of fact, connection, wires the brain for two things: impulse control and willingness. So think about that person that you have a really, really good connection with, and think about that person that not so connected with, right? And when you think about those individuals, you're more willing to have a little bit more impulse control with the one that you're connected with than you are the one that you're not connected with. So we have to remember it's all about the relationship. And then we have to think about, as leaders, are we thinking about that, right? Is that truly at the forefront of our mind? Do we have the capacity to express empathy? Because Dr. Brene Brown says empathy fuels connection, right? And when you can walk in those shoes, empathy fuels connection, sympathy drives disconnection. And when you think about this as a whole, what I want you to think about is the blueprint for resiliency. And you have to have knowledge, right? We have to start talking about this more in our early childhood space and more really at the center level. That's why I was so excited to be here with you today, because I talk about it in pre-K and district and, those spaces all the time. But are we really talking about and are we really teaching this in our early childhood centers? Those are my roots. That's where I came from, right? So we have to have knowledge about how all of this works. And then we have to have insight, right? We have to really be able to understand who those children are in the classroom and understand who those adults are that are caring for them. We have to have some strategies. We have to really begin to continue the learning when it comes to strategies and structures. And that's one thing that when I think about Frog Street that I'm really most proud of, that it's built right into our continuum of curriculum, conscious discipline, Dr. Becky Bailey's work. So it begins to build those strategies and structures in the classroom. Because what you have to do is give that evaluation of who are you serving, right? Who are you serving? Who is working in your classroom? Again, it goes back to the insight, because in some of our most vulnerable populations, there could be a lot to peel back in that onion. And then finally, when you think about social emotional well-being, and it goes back to the question of what do you think about when you see the word safe? Does it really matter? And it absolutely does. It absolutely does. Because remember, that's the foundation for all other learning. And sadly, what we know is that there are far too many children who are suffering today. There are far too many early childhood providers who are living with some of those things that continue to have an impact on them, hence have an impact on that classroom. And so when you think about what it is that we're responsible for teaching in the classroom when it comes to social emotional learning, this is a tall order to fill, isn't it? Self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. And then when you look at the screen and you think about who is responsible for those experiences that those children are having to teach these foundational skills, right? These foundational skills. You have to think about it. Are they capable of that? Are they capable? And then secondly, you have to really think about how important it is. And Dr. Becky Bailey says that self-regulation is the key to school readiness and more powerful predictor than IQ to academic achievement. But I challenge you to really think about it as a life success, And many of you on this call probably have had that person who has worked for them that lack, and I know I did, that lack some self-regulation skills, right? They weren't able to get to work on time for whatever reason. They weren't able to control their emotions. All of those kinds of things. And yet, I just shared with you, they are the most powerful thing in that classroom. They're that active ingredient. And so, in the words of Dr. Bruce Perry, all of these caregivers and teachers are so important, right? They're this potential source of love and learning and comfort and stimulation. But when he takes a look at who is in that classroom, here's what he says. They're shaping that future. Just think about the hours. Just think about the hours that those kids are in those classrooms with those adults. They're shaping experiences wire the brain, repetition strengthens the wiring, right? And sadly, it's not only about the good experiences that wire that brain. It could be any experience. And so when we have to think about something that I heard Father Gregory Boyle. He runs a huge program in the LA area for the incarcerated population. And he's got some wonderful books, but one that I highly recommend, Tattoos on the Heart. In that book, and when I heard him speak, he talked about attachment repair. Because remember how early attachment is wired. He talked about attachment repair. So we're having to sometimes teach attachment repair, right? As the center director, as the coach, we're having to really build that relationship with somebody who might not trust people. Hence, what we have to understand about attachment repair is that adults nor children can't possibly calm themselves down if they've never been soothed themselves. So how important is that attachment repair? And finally, we have to think about going back to thinking about stress and the types of stress. And positive stress is like getting on Zoom. Is it going to work today? Are there going to be any glitches? Am I going to be able to launch the pulse? Positive stress kind of keeps us going, doesn't it? It gives us that oomph that we need. But when it reaches that toxic level, that prolonged level for the adult who's responsible for those kiddos, that's when it can become threatening. When it reaches that level in that child, that's when you're going to see little Melissa displaying those behaviors that we don't like to see in our classrooms, because often in the tool belts of those who are caring for them, they just don't have the tools to deal with them. And so we know that stress can do some really, really bad things to our bodies, right? But one of the most important things that I want you to think about is that every single cell in your body continues to eavesdrop on your thoughts. Every single cell in your body continues to eavesdrop on your thoughts. And so when we think about the optimal brain wiring, we have to think about stress, and we have to think about the baggage that not only those adults are carrying, but also those children. And I want to remind you that children who are typically developing, they think about survival the least. But those who are living in that traumatized state, and actually even adults who are living in that traumatized state, they're thinking about survival the most, right? And cognition the least. We know from scientific research that toxic stress really does harm brain architecture. It really does harm brain architecture. We want to stay in that place of love, trust, and safety. But it's those experiences that we take in from the outside world, of those millions of sensory experiences that are happening each and every moment, that we don't often think about. And that trauma really does have an impact on learning. It has an impact on the executive function skills. It has an impact on just building relationships. Because remember, it's about all of our past experiences, even in that little baby or that little toddler that you have walking into your center. Have there been responsive caregivers in their lives? And so hence, how has their brain wired? It's not easy just to flip a switch when they walk into your center to say, you know what, this is a safe place to be. You have to work at having that sense of safety and security, building that sense of safety and security with in the relationship that the child has with the adult who's caring for them, right? That's a lot of work. And if trust has been broken, friends, it's not going to be something that comes easy, especially when you're getting into the 3 and 4-year-old classrooms. So how do you begin? You're going to have to begin with going back to that KISS framework, right? You have to have that knowledge, that insight, those strategies and structures. You're going to have to remember that everything that you do, whether it's child-focused or adult-focused, it's about the relationship. Relationships are at the heart of learning. Connection wires the brain for 2 things. And you have to remember who that active ingredient is in the classroom. And we have to think about, are we concentrating on the adult just as much as we're concentrating on those children? And finally, sometimes that takes a perspective shift a little bit, right? It takes a perspective shift. Instead of when those behaviors are displayed, instead of what's wrong with you, my gosh, little Melissa, what is wrong with you? To now, what happened to you and how can we help? Because in order to get into this learning where we all want to be, and we want those children to be, right? We have to feel that connection and that sense of love, trust, and safety. And you have to ask yourself, what brain state are you in when you walk into that center? What brain state are those adults who are caring for those kiddos when they walk into that classroom? Sometimes it takes a mind shift, right? It's a total different perspective that we have to think about. And, we do this by having a predictable routine. One of the structures that we have in place and the strategies in Frog Street is that we start out every day the Brain Smart Start way, right? We unite, we bring that class together as that classroom community. We build lots of connections. We teach them how to calm themselves down. Even the youngest infant, we're doing these deep breathing exercises to begin to teach that self-regulation. And then we're building community and teaching commitment and how important those are. And so, but you've got to think about someone first. And that first person that you have to think about is the adult that's in the classroom. And it's so important to think about who really is responsible for those experiences and taking self-care into consideration, right? Giving them, that break that they need, really helping them to understand how important self-care is. Because what you have to really think about, and it goes back to the very first question that I asked you, what is your role? Your role is to begin to build resiliency in your community, whether that's with the adult interaction and those adults transferring those skills to those children. But in order to do that, children must have regulated adults in their life, my friends. They must have regulated adults in their life. And so what will the outcome be? Well, the outcome is going to be that you're going to have this kind of optimal learning environment that's safe, that's predictable, that's consistent, that's positive. And that's where true healing and learning actually begin. And so as we close our conversation today, one of the things that I want you to think about in order to build those resiliency skills, you have to think about who is the active ingredient in the classroom and start the conversation there. Your takeaway, I'm hoping that you will be able to consider the importance of a more trauma-informed approach. And certainly, I hope that you do something about it, that you continue the conversation that we began today by further professional learning. We at Frog Street are available for that for you, should you so choose. I'll put my email address into the chat box. But most of all, I want you to remember, as a society and as early childhood professionals, alone we can do so little, but guys, together, the more we begin to talk about this, we can do so much. Thank you so much. I think we have a drawing. So I think we actually have a drawing for somebody who was in Awesome. And I think we're going to draw for one of our puppets from Frog Street. You're very, very welcome. Yes, I'll be happy to give the list of videos that I spoke about to Storm, and she can send it out with the recording. Okay. And are there any questions? If you have a question, you can type it in the chat box. I'd be happy to answer it for you. You're most welcome. Again, like I said, we're beginning to scratch the surface of this conversation. Yes, somebody chimed in.
Hi, Melissa. This is Storm with NCCA. We had just one question about working with homeless families who are in care. I don't know if you have a resource as well that perhaps we could include that would address homeless trauma.
Yeah, I actually have a good video that I'll send you the link to, and it really just puts homelessness into perspective for individuals. And I think when it comes to homelessness, that's really one of the things that we want to do. We want to make sure that people understand the stress of homelessness, right? Because it's the stress that's going to impact the lives of children and families, and ultimately their behaviors.
Perfect. All right. And then we have randomly selected the winner. So Mariah, do you want to announce the winner?
Yes. So the lucky winner of Miss Fanny Frog is going to be Barbara Dubik. I don't know if I pronounced that correct or not. So we will be sure to make contact with you off congratulations, off of the webinar, and we will get your personal information to pass along to the lovely folks at Frog Street.
Well, it has been a pleasure sharing the information with you. And as you guys are going back to your respective communities, I hope that you really do continue the conversation and you really think about, you know, how much of an impact we truly have when it comes to, you know, shaping our future generations, because this is truly really what it's all about.
And Cindy, do you want to wrap us up?
I do, and thank you, Melissa. This was a great beginning to what we hope will be an ongoing discussion with Melissa, who will hopefully come back to us in a few months and continue on, because this is a huge topic, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to get more information from Melissa, who's definitely, you know, a well-trained expert in this area. And we know that the pandemic has definitely increased some of the trauma that Melissa has spoken to us about. I also would like to camp on to what she just said at the end about future generations. Being a resident of Oklahoma for 30 years, where there is one of the highest populations of Native Americans in that state, saying that I learned while living there was what we do today affects the next 7 generations. So this is a really critical piece of how we can affect the next 7 generations. I would also like to just go back and say, I totally missed my cue at the beginning and did not realize I was, you know, on, you know, already on the whole webinar when Mariah introduced me. And don't ask me why. I think it's because I'm 66 and and a little attention deficit. But I did want to make sure that you knew about our new business affiliation with Frog Street. Frog Street is a leading provider of early childhood solutions that feature high quality curriculum, child assessments, and engaging professional development opportunities. Thus, like you just had the opportunity to have with Melissa. Frog Street is also a very proud advocate of policies and initiatives that build capacity and high quality early childhood experiences through a mixed delivery system. And I would just also like to mention that it was Brenda Lager. I hope I pronounced Brenda's last name correctly. I'm sorry if I didn't. Who, actually brought us, gave us the opportunity to partner with Frog Street as an affiliate. And she works on, at the federal level for Frog Street on policies that do affect children and do affect childcare providers. So I want to thank her for that. And I don't remember if Melissa actually mentioned this, but in addition to being the professional learning project manager for Frog Street, she's also a faculty member at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And I do recall that she mentioned that as an advocate for children and families for over 30 years, she is very active as the co-chair of the Early Childhood and Education section of the South Texas Trauma Informed Care Consortium. So I apologize, Melissa and Brenda, for having this at the tail end. But thank you for your understanding. And thank you to all our participants. We know that staffing is tough out there right now, and to even get on this call, is a huge, huge effort on your part. And know that we think of you every day, and we are working for you to hopefully improve things. Keep in mind that the Build Back Better Act is being discussed and debated in Congress as we speak. And for those of you that get our emails, we are sending you out information on a regular basis to know how to make a really quick connection with your U.S. legislator to let your desires be known about what it is you need help with, as far as funding to support a high quality business for you, and better salaries for your staff, and anything else that you need. You certainly should and can do this at this time, because we are talking a lot of money on the table for childcare for the first time ever. And it's a good time to make that connection. And we try to make it simple for you. Thank you so much to all of the essential providers, owners, and educators out there. We appreciate you. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.